Welcome back to the Environmental Law Monitor. I'm your host, Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell LLP's Environment, Lands, and Resources Practice Group, and it's a place for thoughtful conversations. We have conversations ranging from the latest developments to perennial topics like litigation, enforcement, and compliance assurance. We're glad you're spending some time with us today. Today's podcast is really about one simple question. What do we mean when we say community engagement? If you're like me, you've come across this term and concept hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times, but it means something differently to everyone. And we're excited to be joined today by somebody who's going to give us a great perspective on what community engagement means and how to do it well. So we're joined today by Jackie Medcalf, who's the founder and CEO of the Texas Health and Environment Alliance. Welcome to the podcast, Jackie.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And we are joined today by Stephen Cook, who I think is about to get his green jacket for repeat appearances on the podcast. But Stephen introduced us to Jackie, and so welcome back, Stephen.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Jackie, I'd love to just start off with learning more a little bit about you and about the Texas Health and Environment Alliance. So what's your story? What led you to start this organization and what's its mission?
Well, I actually had no intentions of ever going into the nonprofit sector, but this really came into my life, and there was no denying that founding a nonprofit and doing this body of work was absolutely essential. So I back up a little bit. I moved to a small town on the east bank of the San Jacinto River when I was a preteen, and my family moved there for a life on the river and recreating. And within a year of moving there, I started having joint issues, and I was having unexplainable digestive issues, and I ran hurdles. And I'd run hurdles for 6 years and thought about going to college, was looking at different schools to run track. And I thought, well, by the time I'm in my mid-20s, I'm going to have my knees replaced if I keep running hurdles. So I moved to Southern California. I wanted to model, and so that's what I did. During my time there, my dad kept getting sick, just east of Houston, and it was difficult to just pick up and come home every time he was sick. And little did we know way back then that all of those things we were experiencing were actually setting the foundation to the founding of THEA. And I eventually started studying environmental geology at the University of Houston Clear Lake, and I had a semester-long case study. I decided to test the well at my family's home, and I ended up finding heavy metals in the water. I then went and got tested for heavy metals, and I had 19 of them in my body out of the 21 that I was tested for. Here I was, in my early 20s, trying to figure out how I had uranium and thorium and cadmium and all of these different elements in my body. And luckily, I was studying the water and realized there had to be something polluting our environment. And I realized that my family's home was situated in between 4 Superfund sites. Even as a geology major, I still had yet to even learn about Superfund sites. So I started just researching constantly about what was going on in the area. I found that one of the sites had not been remediated, and that was the San Jacinto River Waste Pit Superfund site. And I started attending the EPA public meetings, and they were incredibly hostile. You had, easily 100 people in the room, people being removed by police. The meetings were unproductive, very hostile, and I could understand what the agency was telling the community, but most of my fellow community members did not understand what was going on. From that, I saw the need for an entity or for someone to inform the community, to break down the technical information on a level that they could understand. And that essentially is what led to the founding of THEA.
So you mentioned THEA's involvement and, your involvement really, maybe more than you would like. It sounds like that, the THEA chose you in some ways. But could you tell us a little bit more about what your involvement today looks like with the San Jacinto River Waste Pits, and maybe give us a little bit of an overview of that Superfund site for some of our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
You bet. So the San Jacinto River Waste Pits is your typical Superfund site that was created pre-EPA, regulatory requirements. And it was a site that originated on the banks of the San Jacinto River, where a local paper mill hired a company to dispose of their paper mill waste. The company dug pits on the bank of the river and disposed of a couple 100,000 cubic yards of contaminated material. A few years later, they abandoned the pits, and due to subsidence, rivers behaving as they do, shifting course, and a local dredging operation, one of the pits made its way into the river. And none of us in the community had any idea that these pits were here for decades. They were positioned right by a popular boat ramp and a river that's loved for recreation, fishing, boating, water skiing. And in 2005, there was a study going on that studied the particles in the river's water column, and they kept finding dioxin in the water column. That's actually what led to the discovery, if you will, of these pits. And by 2008, the site was listed as a Superfund site, as on the national priority list for cleanup. And I got involved in the site in about 2011. During that time, again, most of us in the community remained in the dark. We were not engaged in the process, and there was a temporary cap being constructed on the northern pit. So there's two primary pits. There's the northern pit. It sits in the river just north of Interstate 10. And then the southern pit, which is, as it sounds, just south of Interstate 10 on a peninsula of land. And there was construction going on at this northern pit. And most of us in town thought they must be building up the land to put some sort of restaurant. And we were excited. We thought, oh, we're going to get a restaurant we can pull our boats up to, and this is going to be great. Little did we know that was actually an incredibly contaminated waste site. None of us had a clue. And, it was a small town. And so everybody was buzzing about what was going to be put on this little area of land. And not long after that is when people started really recognizing that that's a Superfund site, and there's dioxin contaminated waste in that site and around that site.
Jackie, you mentioned telling your story about attending the EPA meetings. Having been at EPA and doing those meetings, we talk about community engagement. You said you kind of understood what was going on, but the rest of the community didn't. What was the struggle there? Why wasn't the message of EPA getting through to the people?
I think the agency historically has been spread very thin. And a remedial project manager might have multiple Superfund sites that they're working on. And so what we often see is community engagement is not done very intensely. There's a little bit that is done, but it's more checking boxes. And so most of the community members were not even aware that there were public meetings. The public meetings are required to be posted in the local newspaper, but back then they would be posted the day of the meeting. And so the meetings were, one, very little notice, but then also the timing of the meetings. Sometimes the meetings would start at 5:00. People are just getting home from work at 5:00. So the notice was short. The timing wasn't great. And I think that left a lot of people in the dark, but also the notices and the way that the outreach is conducted doesn't express any type of urgency or really relevance. Oftentimes, it's more of a defensive notice saying, here's an issue, but don't worry, nothing's wrong. So people don't take them seriously. They disregard them. And oftentimes, if they get something in the mail, they're disregarding it as junk mail because it says it has no relevance to their property. So folks weren't just simply across the board being informed in a way that it was meaningful for them.
You used the word intensity or intensely. So what is your thoughts on community engagement? Is this something that needs to be happening? Is this daily? What's the content? Help us understand how do they hear what's being told by them, whether it's by the PRPs at the site or EPA versus perhaps what the agency wants to. I think about that because one of the things that struck me during my time at EPA is a lot of the communities I would visit, it seemed like the people were stuck in whatever condition the site was when they first saw it. Despite the fact that 20 years of work had gone, there was one site where they had truly been drinking contaminated water, but that was 20 years ago. There had been a water treatment plant in there for 15 plus years. And in fact, the treated water the city actually sent to another part of town. That community had been seeing clean, uncontaminated water for over a decade. But when you talk to the community, somehow They didn't get that. They felt like they were still being exposed. And so there's just this over 20 years of work by EPA, and it's as if nothing had changed.
I understand that completely, because what we saw in the San Jacinto communities was regular engagement was critical. We today are working in 3 different communities across Harris County, and that's because we figured out that there are a few basic principles that if you combine them, you can actually impact this process in the communities in a positive and meaningful way. And we struggle with the same thing in the beginning. The first few years of working with the community is difficult. And I'm not just saying 1 or 2 years. I mean 3, 4 years it actually takes to have a regular presence to be able to transform the people's understanding, because you do see folks who really struggle to move past that initial understanding and realize what the situation is today, and recognize also we can't go back, right? We're never going to fully understand or be able to go back, but this is the situation right now, and here's how we can move forward. So we started hosting monthly meetings in the communities around the waste pits. And for several years, I hosted meetings twice a month in the community. And each time we'd, meet, we first started meeting at the local chamber of commerce at around 2 folding tables, a handful of people. And each time we had a goal to outgrow that meeting space, and we'd go door to door. We'd canvass at the grocery stores. We'd make phone calls. We'd flyer the communities, figured out all the different ways which you can reach people, because not everybody receives their information the same. And that's a really important factor of community engagement. So we would host these meetings regularly. And then we saw the Superfund process start to transform with the EPA, because when they would come to town, the local community members were engaged and they were informed. When the EPA threw out a term like this groundwater well had 74 parts per trillion TCDD dioxin in it, residents knew what that meant. 3 years prior, residents wouldn't have understood what that meant. So when a community has the information in a way that they understand, they can actually show up and have a productive meeting and weigh in on the decision-making process. And that's one of the most important components in the decision-making process, because if a community is not engaged or informed, they can't make appropriate decisions, one, to protect their family from what could potentially be in their environment, but then also they're potentially not going to make the best decision on what a remedy should be or what the outcome actually looks like. And this case of the San Jacinto site, we actually organized over 55,000 supporters for our position, which was to strengthen the proposed remedy. And in 2017, after Hurricane Harvey, EPA's previous administrator, Scott Pruitt, actually signed the record of decision for exactly what Thea and the 55,000 plus supporters were asking for. And that was to clean up the site to a residential level. The proposal was to clean up the site to an industrial level, because if you just exit the freeway, it looks really industrial. But to those of us who live there, we know just a block away is the nearest home, and that most of us love boating on that river, or just going north of there to the beach area on the river where, most of us spent so much time growing up. And that's truly, an example of what it means to have a community be engaged and be able to transform the process, because the parties who are potentially responsible for this site were pushing their agenda for the cleanup. And then we had our local government who was pushing their agenda and their ideas for this cleanup. And so you had a variety of different stakeholders presenting their ideas and their opinions. And ultimately, the EPA ruled in favor of the community.
So Stephen's question's about how EPA engages with communities well. But I think a big part of the story of community engagement and effective community engagement is how companies or industrial groups engage with communities as well. And so, Jackie, in your experience, are there companies or industrial groups that do this well? And if so, what are some common characteristics of those that do?
Well, I actually don't have any experience with companies that do this well. Several of the sites that I've worked with throughout the past, 10 plus years, the companies have an incredibly adversarial position. And have not remained objective in this process or even willing to show up and be a part of these community meetings. And I think that's step one, right, is showing up. And there is one community that we work with, Houston's Greater Fifth Ward, where if I have had any experience at all with a company doing outreach well, I would say it is there. Because step one, the company shows up. They actually attend the EPA's public meeting and have hosted meetings with Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And so they're at least there. They're at least present. And so they are at least showing the community that they are a part of the process. And I think when we all sit down at the table together, when we're all in the same room, that's when we can really start working strategically towards solutions and having an open and honest dialogue. But I definitely have, suggestions on how companies can do this well beyond showing up and beyond making their way into the community.
It strikes me, Jackie, that if a company is going to advocate for a more cost-effective approach to a particular facet of a cleanup, being in the room where you can talk with community members to get them on board would be a really effective way to, advocate for a company's interests while also engaging the community and getting them on board. But if you're not in the room, then your proposal just seems like paper flying into a meeting. What are some other characteristics or what are some other things that you see there being a positive role for companies getting engaged with communities and engaged in the process?
It's important for companies to go into these processes with more than just the agenda for meeting their bottom dollar, meeting the bottom line, right? Because what costs the least amount up front might actually cost much more over time. So for instance, of the San Jacinto site, you have contaminants that the EPA estimated would remain toxic for over 750 more years. That's what the community's thinking about. So going into the communities, thinking about the long-term impact here, not just the next quarter, not just, the next 5 years, but what can actually be done over a lifetime to make a difference is really important for companies to understand and to look at, because going into a community and advocating for a solution or presenting a particular picture to them is going to be best received if it's meeting folks really where they are, right? If someone is thinking, I bought this house on the river and I want to pass it on generation after generation, then you need to provide that long-term scope. How is it really going to protect the area for the next 50, the next 100 years? Because that's what most of the locals are actually going to care about.
You used the word picture, and that leads me to think, are there particular graphs, diagrams, visual aids, techniques for conveying messages that you've seen are effective? It sounds like even your own group, you had to learn how to communicate with the community so that they really were getting the message that you wanted to send in a way that you wanted it to be understood. This is one of my frustrations with EPA. Frequently, the messages we put out were not understood in the way we wanted them to be understood. They weren't received as we intended. And so you have any ideas on that? What works in helping communities to really understand the picture of the site?
Simple graphs and any types of pictures or simple diagrams are absolutely critical for a community's understanding, because it's easy for us to have these concepts and theories in our heads and understand when we look at something that has, the strata and the aquifers and the different layers beneath ground and the arrows, the little markers on the side talking about depths. We understand that type of stuff, but your average community member doesn't. So if you put something up on the screen that has a lot going on, that's very busy visually, folks are not going to understand. And you want to hold your audience and you want to keep your audience. And that's really important. And being able to show them something visually, again, that's simple enough for, we like to usually say a fifth grader, simple enough for a fifth grader to look up there and understand, but also give them geographic perspective of an area they care about, their property, their kids' school, something like that. And really, as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's true. So being able to show them through something other than putting up a PowerPoint with nothing but bullet points and expecting them to read everything and listen to you at the same time, that's not going to keep your audience because it's already so high level. You've really got to bring it down with simple images that they can understand and understand quickly.
You mentioned something earlier, Jackie, that I'd like to unpack a little bit. And you said it's important for companies to remain objective about the process of community engagement. And so what do you mean when you say objective? It sounds like that's probably not objective about the economics of a cleanup as far as the company sees it. But tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Sure, I would love to. So when I say that companies should remain objective, I mean that they need to be open to more than just the solution that fits the bill, that fits the amount of money that they want to spend on that particular cleanup. They have to think beyond that and at least be open to having discussions beyond that and looking at things holistically. Here's an example. At the San Jacinto site, the community for years said there's no way those pits are only 12 feet deep. You had residents who would have firsthand accounts and say, no, I've seen the old engineering drawings, or my uncle worked on that site and told me they went down 20 feet. You'd have these real life accounts, and the companies and EPA were saying, no, those pits are only 12 feet deep. So guess what? When the record of decision was signed, it was to clean up to a recreational standard down to 12 feet deep. Well, then when we entered into the remedial investigation, they found that in areas, the waste was almost 30 feet deep. And so now that's a huge problem with the path that this site set out for the cleanup. But had they been willing to hear the community's concerns and what the accounts they claimed, and not just so narrowly focused on the agenda at hand, we could have 7 years ago worked towards a remedy that would be more inclusive, something that would be perhaps even done by today, had we known back then the full extent of the site. But the process lacked objectivity because they were so narrowly focused on the absolute cheapest cleanup and not really what's best at the site. And then, I'll give an example at a Superfund site that we work with, an orphan Superfund site where there's not a polluting entity. That's a whole other issue of lacking objectivity, because then you just have the EPA hiring a contractor directly themselves, and you don't have that third party, the potentially responsible party, bringing in their opinions and their viewpoints. And so either way, when you have a company involved or you don't, you can still wind up with the process lacking objectivity. And at the end of the day, there's no set of knowledge that is more important than the local communities, because they've lived there. They've been there. They know so much about what goes on, and that should really be valued by companies in these processes.
What you're describing it's more of a listening skill, getting EPA companies to listen to the community. How do you go about doing that? What does good listening look like to you?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there with that one. And I think that one of the things companies can do better is bringing in people who are patient, people who have compassion and empathy and the ability to listen. One thing we see is the representatives often from our agencies, from companies involved with these sites, come in and they don't have the patience to listen to the communities. And first and foremost, oftentimes the residents are frustrated and they want to be heard. And it takes a lot of listening to get through the frustration to then actually be able to have more of a productive dialogue. And listening, first giving the residents and the stakeholders an opportunity to express themselves. And I don't mean passing around note cards and telling everybody that they can only put their questions or comments on a note card, but people actually want to be heard, right? They want to vocalize their concerns, their opinions, their beliefs, what have you. And having people in the room who are patient, who can have compassion and actually give a response to the resident that makes them feel heard. And what a representative from a company can do is beforehand, they can prepare those canned responses in their heads, right? It doesn't have to be, a very personal response like, I heard you and I understand your daughter, Sarah, has this cancer and I'm very sorry, which that would be wonderful, but that's not exactly what a community member is expecting. We're just expecting something beyond the thank you for your comment next type of response. Responding in a manner that actually allows the resident to feel heard, to feel that they made the best use of their time that evening or that afternoon, showing up, standing in line at the microphone, getting the courage to speak in front of their peers and say what they've had to say.
Frequently, these public meetings are set up to where it is just a line of people making comments and there's no interaction with whoever's listening, whether it's an agency or the PRP or whoever. How effective is that? Should there be changes made to that kind of structure? Or because one thing I did learn at EPA was there is a lot of value to giving people their 3 minutes or 5 minutes to say their piece that as an engineer, you may not think because it doesn't make sense to you because I can't put that into an equation. But for community relationships, there truly is a value to letting the community air that frustration or that perspective in a public forum.
It's really important that the public forum has more than the remedial project manager, more than just a technical expertise. Having a community involvement coordinator that can level with the community, that can speak to them on a relatable way is really important. And one thing that companies and the agencies often miss is setting the meetings up in a format that actually means something to the community. Know your community, right? If you were litigating, you're going to study the opposite side in depth. Study your community. Know your community. No community that we work with is the same. Nothing works exactly the same in each community. For example, in East Harris County, we know that we can have a meeting that starts at 6:30 and maybe we're going to start it at 6:35, but it's roughly going to be started on time. It's going to conclude roughly on time. And then you have to have about a half hour afterwards for folks to come up and ask questions to, the community involvement coordinator, the subject matter expert, what have you. Well, then go to the heart of Houston. The communities we work with there never start on time. So guess what? For those communities, have a half-hour open house on the front end where people can come in on their own time as they choose and talk to those subject matter experts up front. And that way there's not the pressure to start prompt at 6:30 because most of the people aren't going to get there till 7. So meeting the community how they function is really important. And on that note, I'll also say that some of the communities we work with, over half of them are Spanish speaking and only speak Spanish in their household. So also hosting these meetings to where you can encompass all of the community, because certain cultures, certain demographics are more hesitant to engage for their own reasons. So if they're made to feel comfortable or they know that they can attend the meeting and they're not going to have their 7-year-old being their interpreter, they're going to be more apt to engaging in the first place.
It strikes me, Jackie, that a lot of the principles you're discussing about, effective community engagement apply also in the sort of new project, new construction context as well. We've been talking about remediation and Superfund and all of this sort of backwards looking stuff where we're engaging communities to figure out what should be done with an issue that already exists, and we can try to understand it. But it also seems like a lot of your lessons, like engaging communities proactively, showing up with not just, engineers, but people with people skills, to quote Office Space, showing up and engaging communities would also be great if you're building infrastructure or you're expanding power plant facility. And so I hope that our listeners will take some of those lessons to heart as well. But one question I had was sort of the flip side of what you've been talking about, Jackie, and it circles back to your experience founding Thea and leading it over these past years. What can communities do better to voice their concerns effectively? We've been talking a little bit about how companies can listen better, how agencies can, host meetings that aren't a terrible time for, for public participation. But what can communities do better? What have you learned? How have you grown in your leadership of the to better and more effectively advocate for community interests?
One of the most important things that residents can do to advocate, for their community, to engage the variety of stakeholders in these different processes, is work on their messaging. Oftentimes, our residents, by the time they learn about something going on in their community, they have a lot to say. A lot of frustration, a lot of opinions, and confusion, frankly. So you might have a resident who means well and who could do really well at advocating for their community, but when they contact the elected official, or if they contact a company, they might contact them with a 7-page letter. And so tailoring their message, tightening up the message is really important so that you're communicating concisely and constructively in a way to where you're not just going to immediately turn somebody off. Because sometimes some of the people who up front could seem like maybe one of the crazies, if you will, could actually be one of the most important people to be talking to. You just have to cut through all of that. And so you mentioned, expanding a power facility, some of these other ways that the type of work I do, the engagement and the expertise I have could translate is getting in early to the communities and communicating before you actually break ground. Talk to them early on, especially if you want to avoid a headache down the road. An example, right now in Houston along Buffalo Bayou, there's a housing project going up. Right now it's a 400-unit structure that is literally mid-construction. It's already several stories high. It's being built. Well, now there is a ton of controversy circulating around this facility. Had there been early engagement, had there been more of an open process in the earlier stages, things might look differently for that structure right now. But right now, they just recently received several violations from TCEQ and are in a heat of controversy in the media and with our local and state and even federal officials. But folks weren't being communicated with upfront.
Dan, if I could step in, it may be odd for the former industry attorney, EPA official, talk about community. Understanding the process. I actually learned this from a site up in Missouri. A group of mothers were heavily involved in this site, but it was 2 years into their involvement where one of the meetings, EPA was going through the 9 parts of the National Contingency Plan. And all of a sudden, finally, the light bulb went off for them. Oh, you have to work within this structure. Therefore, it explained to them a lot of the behaviors they saw because EPA was trying to make sure everything fit within those elements of the National Contingency Plan. So whether it's getting a permit for a new project, everything, there is a process. It is a bureaucracy. Things move through a process. So if everybody will learn the process, you can be more effective getting in earlier. So, but it takes time to learn that. That is not a 30-minute discussion with 5 PowerPoints and a simple graph. And voila, you now know how to permit a pipeline or get a construction permit for a new source or to settle on a remedy for a Superfund site. It takes time, but that's part of that thing. And Jackie, I'd ask you, one of the ideas I had when I was at EPA was that perhaps at all these meetings, there ought to be kind of a table off to the side or that has a simple meet people where they are in the process. If this is the first time at the site, they're going to have no idea what an NCP is or what a major modification is for a permit. So there's that basic element of education that probably ought to be in every public meeting, easily available websites that people can go learn that. And then others where there's more detail about where we are and constantly referencing where a project is in this process. And such may be helpful ways for agencies and project owners to be more communicative and more helpful in their communication to the public. What are your thoughts on that?
Stephen, I had that same thought as we were talking earlier. I've been here 5 years and combing through regulations and learning processes is difficult, even for an attorney who's, sort of a mid-level associate. And that's after 3 years of law school. I think that there's a real barrier to entry, not just in terms of learning about any particular site and what's gone on in the past. And goodness knows how expansive documentation at some of these Superfund sites can be, but also just learning the process, learning what RIFS means and all the many other niche jargon terms, right? I think it's a really important thing for agencies and to the extent it's helpful for companies to take a shared role in educating the communities just about what's going on in simple terms, because a lot of these things can be distilled right? You don't need to become an engineer or some sort of technical expert to meaningfully engage. And so I just echoing your question, your observation, Stephen, totally agree. I think that's part of the story here.
Oh, absolutely. For the community to understand the process is so important, because the Superfund process is a daunt, right? And so sometimes you don't see the actual cleanup for 20, 30 years. And that's really hard to comprehend when you are the person that sees that site daily. And they might have sick loved ones at home. It's daunting for them to think of, when is that going to get cleaned up? They said this was a process. Why aren't I actually seeing anything take place? And that's a key role that we play in communities, is helping them understand the process, where that site is in the process, and how they can help it move towards the next phase in the process. It's so important. And honestly, sometimes I'm kind of the bad guy in the communities, because I am the one telling them, I hear you, I hear your concerns, but that can't be addressed right now, because that's not where the site is in the process. There's not a public comment period right now. That comes next. And so if they can understand that and set those reasonable expectations, I think they can have a more of the will to remain engaged in the process and have less frustration. Also, with what both you, Stephen, and Daniel touched on, was it reminded me of how flexible presenters and the companies and the agencies should be when they come to a community, to be flexible and willing to get to know their audience. When you start a presentation, don't be afraid to say, raise your hand if you know what a Superfund site is. Raise your hand if you understand the importance of this power facility we're proposing to put in your community. Or then that way you can be flexible and be prepared to pivot initially. Because if you're going to give a 45-minute presentation on Superfund in the process and people don't even know what a Superfund site is, they're probably sitting there, and every time you say that word Superfund, in their head, they're like, what does that? So up front, be flexible and be prepared to give a definition right up front to meet them where they are.
Jackie, as you've been talking, one of the things I keep thinking about is this phrase you see in like public relations a lot, that the cover up is always worse than the scandal itself. And whenever some celebrity or athlete does something that they shouldn't have done, but then lies about it, it ends up making it into a far bigger problem for them than if they had come out, owned what they did, and said, I'm sorry, I'm going to work on myself, I'm not going to do it again. The whole usual public relations recommended script. So I've been thinking about that as we've been talking, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of residents are probably, aware that industrial activity has been happening in the United States for a really long time. And it probably would not surprise too many residents to learn that a lot of that activity was started or undertaken before a lot of environmental laws were in place to govern the disposal of hazardous waste or other things. And so I'm just curious, if a company came out and said, this is the nature of activity at the site. This is what we think the real exposure risks are to you and to your communities. And this is what we want to do with it. This is the most cost-effective option that we think also addresses, your concerns. Is a community going to view that company more favorably for just having been honest and forthright? Or is that just a sort of a sentimental thought that community engagement would be helped by just frank conversations?
I do believe that community engagement would be supported by more upfront and frank conversations, but I caution folks for talking about cost effectiveness, right? Especially, if you're coming in a larger company and you're explaining why a remedy should be or why a certain decisions should be, and you talk about cost effectiveness, someone in that audience is guaranteed going to sit there and think about maybe the miscarriages they've had or the cancer that they or their loved one have had. And you can't put a dollar figure on that. There's no amount of money, that you could put on that. And that's how I felt, way back back 10 years ago when doctors told me I'd never had kids. In my mind, when you come in and you talk about cost effectiveness, you can't put a dollar on potentially of taking that away from me. Right. So, let's talk about other parameters also, why, this is the best decision for the community.
That's a very intriguing question, Daniel, and an important topic because money does play a role in all these things. I mean, and I don't think the community is unaware of that, but how you go about talking about it. And there are times to be candid. I'll share from my couple prior lives ago, the company I was working for had declared bankruptcy. An EPA calls me. We were in the middle of a big Superfund site up in Michigan. And they say, you need to come to the public meeting and present to the people what the company has done and what this means from a bankruptcy standpoint, that the money we were spending in the community was gone. We were done. It was going to be settled in bankruptcy court and such. And I show up in town. I get there early. And on all the stores downtown, there are signs about the public meeting. I go, okay, this is going to be interesting. And then there's a rally going on in the park across the street. I go, great. This is going to be a lynching. I'm thinking maybe I may not want to attend this meeting. Fortunately, I went over to the park and saw what those people were rallying about. It was a Tea Party rally. So it had nothing to do with the Superfund site. But I get to the Superfund site and it was not the most comfortable situation to stand up in front of a room of 40, 50 people and explain all the good work we were doing and such is stopping tomorrow. We're done. That's not an easy message to communicate, but it helped because one, it built credibility with the agency that, okay, we owned up, this is what we did. And it helped the community understand why we were walking away. And then later down the road, as we went through the bankruptcy process, had a conversation with the EPA, continuing to ask us to help out with certain things to help them transition to what the new model was going to be without our company involvement. And there is a place for candor and honest and straightforward, but leading with cost effective is probably not it. But technical issues that, we could, money does have to come in. Is there a way to talk about money, Jackie, that works or that at least explains to the community? Maybe nobody's going to be happy about it, but that topic's, it's there.
Sure, absolutely. And it is one of the parameters that is considered when you're looking at selecting a remedy, right? The cost effectiveness. And it's going to come up, right? It's a huge piece of this. But I think that if you also discuss the other reasons why this makes sense that support it and it is cost effective rather than, we're doing this because this is cost effective. I think that's the best approach. And, you were spot on and coming in and owning the situation and then talking about what's next. Okay, so this happened. This is where we are right now, but here's what we're going to do about it is a really great approach for the community because otherwise, they just are left really frustrated and not really knowing where it could go. And then, with owning the situation, particularly for companies, joining in and like the victimhood is not really a great way to go. And I've seen that. I've seen it where, there's success or liability and a company comes in and goes, look, we weren't required to look under the hood. Okay. So you're basically like coming in with a community that feels like victims and basically saying you're one of them too, rather than look, we acquired this. Here's what we're going to step up and do about this.
Well, Jackie, it's been wonderful to spend some time with you. I've learned so much talking with you for this episode, including that I may not be your leadoff hitter when engaging with the community. I'm going to continue to learn about ways to effectively talk about these things. And I think I really appreciate your thoughts on what things to be frank about and forthright about and ways to be sensitive to the real things that communities have experienced in connection with some of these sites. So thank you so much for spending some time with us. It's been really helpful. And I think whether you are a law student or in-house counsel or an environmental consultant or any of our other listeners, you will have found plenty of value and plenty to think about. So thank you again for showing up, Jackie. Appreciate it very much. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you guys for having me.
That's it for us today at the Environmental Law Monitor. Big thanks to our guests, as well as Dorn, Emily, and the rest of our production team who helped to make this episode possible. And of course, thank you, our listeners, and we'll talk to you soon.